Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this Group of 78 webinar on the topic Back to the Future for Afghan Women and Girls, featuring Corey Levine as our distinguished speaker. My name is Richard Harmston. I'm the past chair of the Group of 78 and also sit on the board of directors. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm making these remarks from the traditional, unsurrendered and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, which continues to be the home to Indigenous people who have stewarded this land for millennia. Today's theme is broadly on Afghanistan, but more specifically on the state of women and girls and the arc of their journey in this century. Our guest speaker today has been both a witness and a participant in this journey, which has been variously hopeful and tragic. The Group of 78 has addressed the situation broadly of Afghanistan a number of times, particularly in our 2012 annual policy conference, where we examined the results of armed intervention from the West in this case, and outlined conditions for the use of military force in the future. Highly restrictive, I can add. A practical matter for the webinar today, we encourage questions and comments from you, the participants. Please write them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we shall do our best to bring them forward to Corey to address. To introduce our speaker, I'm delighted to call on Eileen Oleksiuk, a friend of Corey's from the time they worked together in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. Eileen had a career in Canada's Development Assistance Program and its Foreign Service, and was responsible particularly for setting up the first Canadian International Assistance Office and Program in Kabul in the early 2000s. She has maintained a dedicated and active interest in the plight of Afghan women ever since. We also proudly recognize Eileen as a longtime member of the Group of 78 and a past board member. Eileen, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. So, good morning, Corey there on the West Coast, and good afternoon to all other friends that are joining this webinar today. I know you're going to enjoy it, because we're very, very fortunate. We have the privilege of welcoming Corey Levine to our meeting today. The brief description that you got of Corey on the invitation will tell you that she has a good background in academic research, and she has some very practical on-the-ground experience in conflict areas. She's worked with a broad range of organizations, the United Nations, contracts with individual bilateral governments, with NGOs, and she's worked in several countries on 3 or 4 continents, I guess, 4 continents. And all this time, she's maintained her focus on human security. That is, and for Corey, that means a focus on the people. More specifically, Corey looked at the effects of on women of conflict and of our own peacekeeping and peace-building efforts. So in studying her detailed resume, it's no wonder I bumped into Corey several times over the course of the years I spent in Afghanistan. And although we had never teamed up before, I noticed that we both worked post-conflict Bosnia and Herzegovina, on Kosovo peacekeeping, and on the elections in Ukraine. So we have a little bit of history together. Now, I really look forward to her assessment on Afghanistan. What went right for us? What went wrong for the people of Afghanistan? And how does she see the current context? Because she was there not too long ago. What suggestions does she have for us? And for, maybe more importantly, for our government, that we could encourage them to go forward and take care of the people in Afghanistan. Thanks so much, Corey, for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Eileen, for that very warm and generous introduction. I am really delighted to be here today to speak with all of you. I'm a big fan of Group of 78 and delighted to be in the company of both Richard and Eileen, both of whom I've known for many years. And with Eileen have had the pleasure of interacting with in Afghanistan. So, as Eileen mentioned, I'd like to start by giving a brief overview of my experiences in Afghanistan over the past 22 years. Um, this will help provide the context of where we are now, what went wrong, and what went right. And then I'll talk briefly about my observations from having come from Afghanistan 2 months ago. I spent a month there over last November, December, and we'll end, as Eileen mentioned, with how Canadians can support Afghan women and girls. So the first time I went to Afghanistan was in March 2002, a few months after the Taliban were removed from power. There was no Canadian presence on the ground at that time. I was actually sent by CIDA to determine how your taxpayer dollars might best be spent on peacebuilding efforts in the country. I bought a burqa, hired a car and a driver, and along with my translator, we drove around almost the entire country from Kabul to Mazar-e Sharif in the north, a 10-hour drive, to Jalalabad in the east and Kandahar in the south. Going to Kandahar was then a 2-day drive. Now it's a mere 10 to 12 hours on a superhighway that was built by the Americans. At that time, the biggest security concern was the risk of carjacking. So I wore the burqa to hide the fact that I was a foreigner and thus hopefully reduce the likelihood of getting carjacked. Everywhere I went in the country, there were signs of optimism for the future of Afghanistan after 30 years of active conflict. And each time I returned in the early years, the changes to Afghanistan were noticeable. Instead of begging on the streets, little girls were skipping to school with their UNICEF knapsacks on their backs. Women were entering the workforce in droves, and there was a sense of a country, change. But as the money continued to pour in from the international community, you could see other changes to the local landscape, especially in terms of fancy homes that were being built, expensive cars that were taking over the roads from, horse and donkeys and carts, and Western goods in supermarkets that would not look out of place here. You could also start to see, after about 2005, 2006, the backlash to all this change and the backlash to all the money that was pouring in. Barbed wire and bomb blast walls were everywhere, and there was security checks to go anywhere, including even just to the grocery store. So what happened in the intervening years? So here are the main reasons why I think that Afghanistan fell apart. First, the international community got the intervention wrong. To quote U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, it wasn't that we employed the wrong strategy. The problem was there were too many strategies. And you could see this shift in strategy on the ground. First, there was the war on terror, where the international community used the excuse of protecting women's rights to go after Osama bin Laden. Then came the nation-building exercise, where billions of dollars was spent to turn Afghanistan into a modern state. But once security in the country started to deteriorate, this was followed by the need to support Afghanistan as a bulwark against Western enemies, particularly China on the eastern border, Iran on the western border, but also Russia, which still has extensive influence in the region due to countries surrounding it that were part of the former Soviet Union. Second, the international community tried to impose a mirror image Western style democracy without understanding the context that they were working in. So you can take, for example, the justice system. The bulk of donor money that went towards justice reform was focused on strengthening the formal judicial system and ensuring the application of the rule of law. This sounds great on paper, except that it ignored the fact that 80% of Afghans use what is known as the informal justice system, which is based on customary laws to settle family disputes and address community grievances. Third, our intervention was geared to an urban educated elite in a country where 70% of the population is rural and only 25% of females and 50% of males are literate. As a result, billions of aid dollars were squandered on programs that benefited the international community at the expense of Afghan needs. And lastly, but equally important, was the corruption that was embedded in everyday life. Everything and everyone could be bought if the price was right. Your civil service entrance exam, a license plate for your taxi, even though you didn't have registration papers for it, a promotion at work, whether you worked in a bank or served with the military. Almost nothing in the country functioned without some form of graft. And so, in hindsight, it's not unexpected that the country fell so easily to the Taliban. People were simply fed up with the endemic corruption as well as all the insecurity. So, what does Afghanistan look like now, 2.5 years after the Taliban have retaken power? Well, first of all, there is the humanitarian tragedy that continues to devastate the country. The statistics are just overwhelming and horrific. I think you're all fairly familiar with in between earthquakes and floods and droughts, very little humanitarian assistance is reaching the country. However, Kabul, on the surface, life seems as it has been for the past 20 years. There's still hustle and bustle on the streets, billboards selling products, people hawking their wares on the streets. Much of life is lived on the streets. People going to work, sitting in parks, eating at restaurants. Even the parliament still looks exactly the same, although it no longer exists as an institution. But if you look a little closer, what you notice is a lack of females on the street. It's all men sitting in parks, in restaurants, and hurrying to work. Most of the government ministries are still there, but with a black and white, or white and black actually, Taliban flag flying above them. The one exception is the former Ministry of Women's Affairs, which has been disbanded and is now the Ministry for the Prevention of Vice and the Promotion of Virtue. There is also now triple the number of police checkpoints. Some soldiers are dressed recognizably as Taliban fighters, black turbans, traditional clothes. Others look like a recruitment poster for the US Army. that they have managed to pillage everything that Western countries, particularly the US, left behind in terms of all the military equipment. There are two government slogans that dominate the city. One reads, "With divine help, our nation defeated America." And the other says, "Islam requires females to obey the laws of Allah and wear the hijab." At one point, we were stopped at a checkpoint because all the female passengers in the car, we had our masks pulled down at that particular moment because we were just finishing eating lunch on the way to a meeting in the car. But not having our faces covered was in violation of the law. So the Taliban soldier told our driver that he needed to keep his women in order. And if the soldier had done anything further other than scold our driver, who was our mahram, our male relative escort, he could have been either jailed or fined, because even though we were the ones in violation of the law, the mahrams are seen to be responsible for infractions like this. But luckily, he didn't do anything other than scold the driver. And this shows how much that the enforcement of the laws really depend on the individual Taliban that you engage with. So, for example, in just a few areas of the country, girls are going to school past grade 6, and some all the way up to finishing high school. Some Taliban officials are willing to meet with women. For example, a friend of mine who works for the UN, she told me that she's able to speak directly to the governor of one province and is able to talk about issues like girls' education. But when she meets with the governor of Kabul province, he only acknowledges her male interpreter, and if she is allowed to speak, which is not often, she has to address the chair of her leg that he's sitting in order not to offend him. An Afghan I know runs a women's shelter in Kabul, very discreetly, I might add, since one of the first things that the Taliban did when they came to power was to close all the shelters. She told me that the commander of the local police station brings her women who are being abused in their home, but this was only after the Taliban showed up at the shelter in the middle of the night, demanding to search the place and questioning her for hours. Now she has a good relationship with them and manages to keep the shelter open based on a sort of unwritten don't ask, don't tell policy. It's clear that the Taliban are not fully united. Afghanistan has modernized considerably since they were last in power, and some Taliban with it. And they also have ISIS to deal with, a group even more hardline and extreme than they are. So this has helped shift some Taliban thinking to a limited extent. But those Taliban who hold more flexible views are still far in the minority, and the rigid ideology that we associate with the Taliban still dominates. So overall, Afghan women, they are disheartened, fearful, and disappointed that the international community has not done more to support them. For example, a recent survey of Afghan women's views that was conducted by UN Women shows that over 80% of women report having prolonged feelings of anxiety, isolation, and suicidal ideation. This in turn has negatively impacted their relationships with the male members of the family who have become quite emboldened by the extreme patriarchal society they are living in. Mental health issues for women have now superseded concerns for their physical safety and is ranked as their second priority only after access to education. And most tellingly, 90% of those who were surveyed do not want the Taliban to be recognized, pointing to the fact that they have repeatedly reneged on their promises regarding the rights of women and girls. There is no Taliban 2.0. Women's access to public space is now just a tiny sliver of what it was 2.5 years ago, and their overall environment has only gotten more harsh and more extreme. So, for example, if you've been following the news on Afghanistan, you will have seen that there have been increasing reports on arrests and beatings for women who are seen to have violated the dress code, as well as public floggings and stonings of women who are being charged with extramarital affairs, which often means that they have gone outside on their own without a mahram to escort them. However, there is, despite of all this darkness, there is, I would say, one possibility for change, and that is in the area of women's economic development. The Taliban seem to be turning a blind eye to women's labor, as long as on the face of it, a man is in charge. So, for example, I met with several women's NGOs outside of Kabul when I was there, who are providing training to women in areas like sewing and poultry care. They told me that the Taliban are leaving them alone as long as their registration documents all men listed in the organization, and as long as it's a man that goes to negotiate with the local authorities on issues that may be affecting the NGO, the running of the NGO. In Kabul, I met a woman who used to have a factory employing 600 people, which was closed down after the Taliban came to power. She's now running a restaurant with only female staff and serving only female clientele. The restaurant had been trashed the night before I went there. And when I arrived, the Taliban were taking a statement from the owner, and promising to investigate the incident. I also met 5 sisters who are in the midst of launching an online clothing store selling their own designs. This was their response to having had to quit university or when they were fired from their jobs. The one area of education where women can continue their studies is in health. Female midwives and doctors are still being trained in order to meet the health needs of women and girls, as it's forbidden for a male medical professional to see women. So I visited a health clinic in a rural area outside of Kabul and met with 3 midwives. Even though the Taliban are not paying them, they are still happy to have them continue as to work at the clinic. For now, their salaries are being paid by a French NGO, although they don't know how long that will last. They're grateful to be able to continue the work, and although the Taliban have halted any health program for women outside of childbirth, they are able to, under the guise of pre- and postnatal care, they are able to offer counseling and other health tips and family planning. I was shocked, actually. I was quite surprised at the array of family planning that they have access to, even though it is illegal now in the country. And working with those experiencing domestic and sexual violence and trying to find support for them. So this overall is the situation that I found in Afghanistan, mostly darkness with a few rays of hope and light. So what is it that we in Canada can do to support Afghan women and girls? Well, first, we can work to keep Afghanistan, and particularly this situation of its females, on the government's radar and in the public eye. We can write letters to our MPs. We can write letters to the editor. We can post comments online. We need, importantly, to remind our government about their feminist foreign policy, which is supposed to guide Canada's international work, and the absolute necessity of applying that lens to Afghanistan, especially in their international development programming. Another example, Canada could grant automatic asylum to Afghan women and girls based on the fact that a self-determined life for women and girls in Afghanistan is not possible under the current regime. This is what a Swiss court recently ruled. Switzerland is the fourth country to grant automatic refugee status to Afghan women and girls who can find their way there, after Finland, Sweden, and Norway, all of which have feminist foreign policies. For those of you connected to academic institutions, you can encourage them to create special scholarships for Afghan women and girls, or to open their online programs by waiving the costs of enrollment. So last year, 20 top-ranked universities in Ireland and UK did just that. They began offering Afghan women and girls free access to their digital learning platforms, and Canadian universities could easily do the same. Lastly, if you're connected to a business here in Canada, encourage them to join the federal government's program, Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot, or as it's known, EMPP. It was set up a couple of years ago to help skilled refugees immigrate to Canada and to provide employers access to a previously untapped pool of job seekers, which is very critical in this time of labor shortages. You can encourage these businesses to join and search for Afghan women and girls to hire. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions and, of course, hear your comments and your feedback. Thanks very much. Back to you, Richard.
Great, Corey. Well, thank you very, very much for this very insightful and really personal, granular view of Afghanistan, something that none of the rest of us, I'm sure, could get close to. And you've seen it up close and personal, and certainly bring a lot of your own passion to it as well. I'm just curious to pursue the business of what we in Canada can do. What's your reaction been to the fact that a lot of Afghan families, including Afghan women and girls, have had a hard time getting to Canada when other waves of refugees have sort of overtaken the scene and absorbed a lot of the oxygen. I'm thinking of subsequently the Syrians who came and were in tens of thousands, and of course now with the Ukrainians as well. What was your reaction to seeing that and then noting the struggle for Afghans to get chosen to come into Canada?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The government did have a special program for Afghans at risk that ran for 2 years, and they're still tying up the loose ends, so to speak, of bringing in 40,000 Afghans and their families. And it was very generous in terms of cutting back on the bureaucracy to bring both those who are sponsored by the government and those who have been privately sponsored. However, the 40,000 spaces that the government allotted were filled a long time ago, almost as soon as Canada announced the program. So it would be great to see that widened. The reason why I mentioned the idea of granting automatic refugee status to Afghan women and girls is it cuts down particularly on the laborious challenges there are with private sponsorship, which is one way that a lot of Afghan women have been supported to come to Canada. It would also be great to see if Canada applied the same red carpet to Afghans that they have applied to Ukrainians. You know, their reasoning of saying why they made it so that you had to go through all the hoops to get permanent residency status before coming is, they're saying, well, people are going to stay, they're not going to return home. And yet they said that any Ukrainian arriving in Canada can automatically be granted a 3-year visa to stay. I don't know of any Afghan who wouldn't, go back to Afghanistan in a heartbeat if they had the opportunity to do. And there's no reason why the government can't apply the same parameters to Afghans as they have done to Ukrainians.
Good, thank you. Can I speak to all of the participants out there and encourage you if you have comments on what Corey has said or questions you'd like to hear further on some aspect of the topic, please fire your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up and run with them.
I see that
Sorry, go ahead, Corey.
I see that someone, Flora, has their hand raised.
But the questions, yeah, she doesn't have access to the screen. So, Flora, could you put your question in the Q&A, please?
Okay. You'd rather I send it in the Q&A?
I see. Oh, you're online now. Go ahead, please. Please ask your question.
Thank you. So, Corey, thanks. That was a very helpful and insightful account of what you saw in Afghanistan. You mentioned the 4 countries that are following the EU directive, which encourages member states to recognize Afghan women and girls as convention refugees based on gender-based persecution. Some of us have actually been trying to use this to help Afghan women and girls at high risk. However, the big challenge is how to get a visa. And I definitely support encouraging the Canadian government to adopt this stance. We not only have a feminist international assistance policy and foreign policy, but we also have guidelines on gender-based persecution, and we were the first country to initiate those. So I'm just wondering, the visa issue is really difficult. You have high-risk women stuck in places like Pakistan, fearing deportation any day. And the only country I know of that has a humanitarian visa is Switzerland, and it only gives that in very extreme cases. So in principle, it's great. In reality, the woman has to be on the country's soil.
Yes, this is, Flora, that's an absolute excellent summation of all the various intricacies surrounding the challenges based on refugee law and our government's own obstacles. And that's why I actually mentioned the Ukraine option that the government has undertaken, because Ukrainians are not don't need a visa before they show up on our doorstep. They just say, "I'm here from Ukraine," and Canada grants them, depending on, whether they are coming to study. Canada grants them, a 2-year study permit or a 3-year temporary permit. And I think, when the crisis first broke out, we were advocating for temporary permits because they're much less onerous than getting permanent resident status. We did this for Kosovo 25 years ago. We're doing it for Ukraine, and there's no reason why we can't do it for Afghanistan.
Right, thank you. Looking for some other questions or any other hands to be raised, and we can give you the mic. So don't be shy. Please jump in. While we're waiting, Corey, how does money get into Afghanistan to people who need it, to the informal and to the NGOs who are operating under the radar and whatever way they can?
Right.
How fluid and open is the situation for being able to actually give support to groups and people who need it?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Well, first of all, it was a huge problem until the government brought in, I think it's Article 41. Forgive me, I don't have it off the top of my head, where money was forbidden to go into Afghanistan because a terrorist regime was in power. This made it extremely difficult for any NGOs to operate. The government reformed this law last spring. There are still issues with it, but now Canadian aid is not so hamstrung by the previous law, but it's still very challenging. Let's face it, a lot of money is going directly into Taliban hands. That is, I guess that's to be expected. The Afghans have a system known as the Hawali system. It's thousands of years old, as a way to transfer money. I don't know how it works. I've used it. I still don't understand, but you send money to a person in Toronto, for example, and somehow a couple of days later it ends up in the hands of the Afghan that you want it to go to. So that's actually a way of supporting local NGOs. The UN has also various agencies within the UN system: UN Women, UN FPA, UNICEF, UN UNDP. They all have programs to sponsor or support local initiatives on the ground, and they have loosened up their criteria to make it easier for Afghans to access funding from the international system. But yeah, it still remains a challenge.
Right. Yeah. You only work at the margins, I guess, under the circumstances you described.
Yes.
We do have a comment and a question from Rana, who thanks you for what you've done for the people of Afghanistan. You're a remarkable advocate, she says. My question for you is, and this is how she poses it, how important is it to have Afghan women be part of the discussions with Taliban on the future of the country?
Thanks, Rana, for your question, and also to let everyone know that Rana is also a remarkable advocate for the women of Afghanistan. Great question. Just yesterday, there was an international conference on Afghanistan in Doha. It was a 2-day conference with a variety of international partners, the UN, donor countries, yeah, various international organizations. And I haven't seen anything talking about the results of this conference. They have been held on a regular basis since Kabul fell to the Taliban for the past over the past 2.5 years. Not a lot has come out of them, but the reason that I raise this is because Afghan women are demanding to be included. Rightly so. Afghan women's voices have not been heard from. And it is critical that Afghan women have access to these high-level forums where their lives are being discussed and are at stake, but where they don't really have a lot of input. And this was actually the same when Afghanistan was a republic, as Afghans call it. Afghan women were always struggling to get included in these high-level conferences and negotiations, and it continues to be a struggle for them. And this is where Canada can take a role in ensuring that Afghan women's voices are represented and ensuring that they hear from Afghan women voices. And one last thing I'd like to point out is there is a diversity of Afghan women's voices, and the international community has tended to focus on the elite of Afghan women, those who are educated, who speak English, who are seen to have, are wonderful representatives of Western views. We need to hear from all Afghans, not just the elite of Afghan women. So thank you for that question, Rana.
An aside, Eileen, if you're still listening in, if there's at any time you have any comments on any of the topics where we've touched on or other comments you want to introduce during the discussion, please feel free to join in and let us know. There is a story here from Peter McKinnon. Do you have access to that, Corey? It's in the chat.
Yes, sure. I can read it out if so it's a comment with the question at the end. So Peter says he's been interested in Afghanistan since going there in the late 70s. Wow. Recently he was involved in trying to rescue and place the Afghan girls robotics team in Canada, a request from the chair of the Robotics Caucus in the US Senate, via a U.S. Artificial Intelligence and Robotics Committee that he serves on. He arranged communication with the Prime Minister, who had met the team when they were here for a robotics competition. His office responded in 3 days, which included a weekend, and directed 2 ministers to follow up. The next outcome was the girls chose an offer from UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Mexico instead of their first choice, which was Canada. The question: are girls able to study beyond your references to women's health? No, unfortunately, girls and women are banned from all higher education past grade 6. This is why it's so important that if Canada could offer access to their digital online programs free of charge, the way that universities in Ireland and the UK have done. There's a lot of informal education happening, but that's mostly at the primary level. And there is also, people are trying to give Afghan women and girls access to education online outside of the country. There was one other thing that I was going to say, but I can't remember now. So if I remember, I promise I will come back to it. Okay.
Right, that's fine.
Yeah, and Peter also notes that several Canadian universities are interested in helping. That's true. WUSC has a program which is focused on Afghans, but their focus right now, their criteria is very limited. It's only for Afghans up to the age of 23, and they have to be living in Pakistan. The University of Windsor has a program, a scholarship program for academics at risk, and they're also right now trying to emphasize support for Afghan scholars. But it would be great to see if individual universities started creating scholarships for Afghan women and girls.
Great, another recommendation to take forward. Yes, I was noticing a comment here from Elizabeth Whitmore. Could Corey please comment on the issues, and this goes back to perhaps to your earlier comment about the diversity among women, Corey. Comment on the various ethnic and religious groups in Afghanistan. I'm involved in an effort to bring a Hazara woman to Canada, and we're dismayed at the apparent lack of support among Afghan women in Canada to support us. This and the fact that she has been rejected twice by Canadian visa officers. The first time because of an error by the officer. That happens, I guess. The second because she is now temporarily in the UK and thus has been assumed to be safe. This is true temporarily, but once her student visa runs out, she is again in limbo. Thank you for your thoughts on this.
Yeah,
Can you provide us some insight into the plurality of women in Afghanistan?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for this question, because this is one of the things that I have noticed. I've gone back twice now since Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. And even the last time that I was there, I would say I was there for 9 months in 2020 and 21 and left just a few weeks actually before Kabul fell. Is that the divisions in between the 3 main communities are now even more stark. For many years during the Republic, um, politically and in interactions, I didn't, they were always there under the surface, but they weren't there, they're publicly, in offices, in NGOs, people from different tribes and ethnicities were working together, and there didn't seem to be a lot of tensions. What the increased level of insecurity brought was people turning inwards into their own communities for a sense of feeling of safety. And the conflict has always been the hardest on the Hazars, who have been you know always a persecuted minority. And now the tensions have completely spilled over into the Afghan communities here in Canada. I've seen it myself, having sponsored 3 Afghan women activists, one Hazara, one Tajik, one Pashtun, and some of the challenges that have arisen because of the different ethnicities. So, yeah, I like to say it is definitely an issue. Canada did have it that persecuted minorities would be given preference in the special program that they set up for Afghans at risk. But now that we're back to regular private sponsorship, it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. So, yeah, unfortunately, I don't have anything really positive to say with that. But other than that, good luck with the women that you're working with.
Thanks, Corey. I see some other questions coming in. Susan Brown has her hand up. Maude, would you be able to give Susan the floor here?
Hello, Corey.
Hello, Susan. Let me just say, Susan Brown is the woman responsible for me becoming an authority on Afghanistan. So lovely to be in touch, Susan.
I couldn't let this opportunity go. I don't know if you can see who else is in the room here.
No.
I can't. It was 30 years ago that when I was chief of the peacebuilding unit at CIDA, that we sent you off to Afghanistan, and you wrote the first comprehensive early warning, early response report for CIDA. So in many ways, you were very early on the scene. We talk about what went wrong in Afghanistan. In the glory days when the Canadian International Development was focusing on socioeconomic development and helping the poorest of the poor, we were somewhat successful in maintaining that purely humanitarian and development space. There are times when the military and security support is necessary for international development programs to work. I think the real problem was that the military vision of success is winning a war, and the international development workers' vision of success is building a new society. And after 20 or 25 years of fighting, the military may decide that they can't win this war. But I think we know from all the good work that was being done with the education of young men and girls in Afghanistan that if we had just stayed the course a little bit longer and educated a whole new generation of tolerant men, that one could hope that a new society would emerge for Afghan women. Now that CIDA has been absorbed into global affairs, are you feeling any impact in the direction or impact that the development community in CIDA has in the Canadian programming that Canada is able to deliver or even consider in Afghanistan?
Susan, that's an excellent question. And I think I need to defer to both you and Eileen, and I see some other CIDA people on the participant list, simply because it's been a long time since I've worked within the organs of the Canadian government. And for me, it's been harder to tell, either working with NGOs or mainly the UN inside Afghanistan. What has been the impact? I'm sure there is one, but I would be grateful if other CIDA, former CIDA staff would be willing to throw their 2 cents in.
Good. An open invitation. Thank you.
Yes,
Great to see you, Corey.
nice to see you. Yeah.
If others want to come in, just put something in chat or put your hand up. Flora, I see your hand up. Is that up from previously, or do you have another question?
Am I speaking now?
Yes, you are. You're on.
Oh, okay. I just sent a question in the chat again, but I don't know if you're privy to this kind of information, Corey, but last year I was able to help 13 Afghans come to Canada, and there are still so many in need of protection through resettlement. But the avenues are now closed. I mean, Operation Afghan Safety is over. The SIM program says it's met its targets for the program to help for Afghans who worked with Canada. And there are a number of qualifications in relation to that program, which I won't bring up now, but I think a lot of Afghans were misinformed about the two-step process and the criteria relating to that program, but I won't go into that now. But the government here says we've met our target of 40,000 Afghans, that's it. Is there any possibility of the IRCC starting a new program for Afghans at risk, particularly given the deportations from Pakistan and the very high risk of very high danger that puts certain Afghans in?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is sort of related to your earlier visa question. I mean, this is something that we have to lobby the Afghan government. I mean, it was very frustrating for all of us who were trying to bring in Afghans at risk through the special programs, because the spaces were filled very, very quickly. It's just taken the government a long time to fulfill its promises on bringing the 40,000 in. So that's one thing, that they need to hurry up the process, because it is in the slowness of the bureaucracy is endangering Afghan lives in Pakistan in particular. But, you know, this is where lobbying needs to happen. There doesn't seem to be any sign that the government is going to open up, you know, a similar kind of program for Afghans, which is why I really emphasize that there needs to be an equal footing between, you know, the program that that Canada has offered Ukrainians and the limits that they have imposed on Afghans. And we can also see, you know, what's happening in the Middle East, they're also, really imposing limits on Palestinians with ties to Canada to get here. So we seem to have, a very narrow definition of who deserves our support. So I really think there needs to be a strong concerted effort to lobby the government to either open up another special program, which I really don't think that they will do, because there were so many headaches with it, but just, to create a more equal footing, I think is probably the best way to go. And you're right, it's going to take years before people can access the economic pathways pilot program. But, the fact that it is there at least offers something. And the more businesses that join in, and the more that this program is made a going concern, the more it should become, a possible avenue.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good. Thanks very much, Corey. I see we're coming to the end of our time that we've allotted. There's a comment. Well, there's a question from Vasilios here, which I'm not sure there's an answer to, Corey, but I'll pose it anyway. Vasilios comments about your love and compassion for the disadvantaged as your motivation that comes through very clearly here. How do you feel we can best nurture this feeling in leaders locally and globally? That's a tough one, but I think it might be a way to wrap up for us. Any quick thoughts on how we can convert our leaders?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. Thanks so much for it. Yeah, I think education is a good way. To develop, more compassion towards our fellow human beings. We are witnessing globally hardening down of the hatches and people moving into their own corners of their community and not in my backyard. And we need to counterbalance that with, education and programs that support people to, do right by their fellow human beings. Yeah, thanks.
Quite so, and I guess as long as we still live in a semblance of democracy, leaders are going to be responsive to some extent, maybe in large measure, to what the electors communicate to them. And if we can communicate better lines of thinking, advocate actions that are more compassionate, more humane, then there may be some response there. And Susan Brown has suggested a massive mail campaign as a possibility, if we could mobilize that. That's a good idea, Susan. Takes a lot of work, and there's many other organizations that are better at it than we are, but it is something that we could look at, perhaps in coalition with other organizations. So that'd be a positive thought for as we take away from the session, and for being able to mobilize around actions that can be supportive, positive for Afghan women and girls in the future. With that, I would like to bring the session to a close with the following thanks. To Eileen for being with us to introduce Corey. It's good to have you online, Eileen, today, so thank you for that. To all the participants for listening in and for your comments and questions. It provided for a really rich discussion in the Q&A, and I think that was a very positive outcome for this session. To Maud Stephanie, our executive secretary in the background there for keeping the electronics moving and the session lively for us. So thank you, Maud. And last but most, to you, Corey, for taking the time and the energy, for sharing your experiences, for bringing a very personal story to us. And we hope this can be a reconnection that we can continue to work on and follow up with you on some of the thoughts you've had for actions. I should let it out of the bag. In fact, I should have said it was right at the top that Corey has a history with the Group of 78 previously. She was for a time prior to going to Afghanistan. For a little while, she was the executive secretary for the Group of 78. So you've come home today, Corey, and for that we thank you as well. So continue to enjoy spring out in Victoria while the rest of us suffer in the rest of the country. Thank you again, Corey, and thank you all to everybody for joining in today. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.